June 5th, 1967. For decades, the NHL was a small community of 6 teams that didn't stretch farther west than Chicago, and that hadn't changed in a quarter of a century. Then, seemingly overnight, the NHL doubled in size, expanding its boundaries to California and landing in such exotic locales as Los Angeles and Oakland. Some of those franchises are gone now. But the expansion of 1967, brought about by the powerful force of televised sports, would change the game forever. The NHL, like most every other major professional sports league, went through many dramatic changes in its early years. Founded in 1917, the league originally consisted of 4 teams: the Montreal Canadiens, the Montreal Wanderers, the Ottawa Senators, and the Toronto Blue Shirts. The Wanderers would disband when their arena burnt down shortly after opening night. But a decade later, the NHL would expand to 10 teams, adding franchises in Boston, Pittsburgh, Chicago, Detroit, a second team in Montreal called the Maroons, and 2 franchises in New York, dubbed the Rangers and the Americans. By the 1942-43 season, however, the Great Depression and World War II had reduced the league to 6 teams. Those teams would come to be known as the Original 6 and would make up the NHL for the next 25 years. But while the NHL remained the same, the world around it was changing. By the early 60s, televised sports was becoming more and more popular in North America, and professional athletes were becoming mainstream stars. Although it had been an early leader in broadcasting, the NHL was watching its TV contract run out in 1960. The threat of a TV deal going to a rumored rival league in Western Canada eventually forced the NHL to act. And by 1963, a new guard within the league's ownership group, led by New York's William Jennings and Toronto's Stafford Smythe, started to press for expansion. In March of 1965, NHL President Clarence Campbell announced plans to expand by 6 teams.
This is the year of the Great Expansion. This year, for the first time, the league will be composed of 12 teams.
There was nothing in the papers in Philadelphia about the expansion plans of the National Hockey League. I mean, as far as the papers here, the National Hockey League didn't even exist. And a banker who made the loan to our group that bought the Philadelphia Eagles was from J.P. Morgan, and he was leaving. He came down to tell me he was leaving, and I said, why? And he said, I'm going to work for Jack Kent Cooke on the coast. And I said, well, what's going on there? And he said, well, Jack has the Lakers, and he has a piece of the Redskins and all of his sports properties, and he's going to try to get a franchise, and he thinks he will, in the National Hockey League. So I said, well, what's that all about? He said, well, they're expanding. They're going to add 6 additional teams. And I said, really? And he said, yeah. And I said, what are the cities? And he railed them off, and I think Baltimore was one. And I said, well, you know, I think we'd be better than Baltimore. So I then applied for a franchise with my group and went up to see Bill Jennings, who was the governor of the New York Rangers and the head of the expansion committee, and we got it. You know, it was a process, but we made it happen.
A year after the first announcement, Clarence Campbell laid out the blueprint for the NHL's ambitious expansion. The league had received 14 bids for new teams. It awarded franchises to Philadelphia, Los Angeles, Minneapolis-St. Paul, Pittsburgh, St. Louis, and San Francisco-Oakland. A bid from Vancouver was rejected, largely because Montreal and Toronto did not want to share TV money. That decision caused a furor in Western Canada. But things weren't much easier for the 6 new teams.
When we went to make the application, they said, well, you have to have an arena. And we said, okay, we'll have it. And, you know, we had the mayor call and say, we've paved the way, there's no problems. We've got the site, they'll be able to do it. And we were voted in as one of the 6 new franchises that cost $2 million cash apiece. So on, I think it was June 30th or thereabouts in Montreal, everybody had to have their $2 million presented to the league, get their franchise. And I was scrambling down here. That's another long story I don't want to get into, but Wallman didn't want to be a part of it, so we split. I left the Eagles. That's another long story, but the point is, I was now responsible for getting the $2 million, and I was scrambling to put it together that day before and got it, and was going to wire it up to Montreal to one of, our executive, Bill Putnam, who was up there, and who was the guy that left for Jack Kent Cooke and came back to run the Flyers at the time. Anyway, there was a blackout, the only one ever in the city of Philadelphia, that day. And nothing was being wired, and everything was down and out. And we finally, so they're waiting there for the money, it's not there. We finally managed to route it through New York to get there. And the whole history of how this franchise started was amazing.
As things turned out, building the new rink in Philadelphia wasn't as difficult as obtaining the financing.
I was involved with a gentleman named Jerry Wallman at the time with the football team, and we decided to apply for the franchise, and I'm the guy who did it all. And so basically we had to build an arena quick. Actually, from the time I had the idea to the time the Spectrum was built was 16 months. The construction period was 11 months, and we got it done in time. But it was quite a thing. I mean, I went to the head of city council here, who I was involved with in getting the stadium for football and baseball down here. His name was Paul Dortona, and said, what if we plunk an arena on the parking lot of what's going to be the stadium? I mean, it'll increase revenues, and parking revenues, will pay rent and so forth. And he loved the idea. Took me right in to see Mayor Tate, and Mayor Tate loved the idea. And he called in the city solicitor and the city finance director right on the spot and said, look, they want to build an arena. He said to the city solicitor, let's get the legal work done. He said to the finance guy, he said, figure out how much the land costs us, divide it over the length of the lease, and let's get this thing going, all in one day.
Canadian businessman Jack Kent Cooke had established himself as a new mover and shaker in sports in the mid-60s. He had purchased the NBA's Los Angeles Lakers and a share of the NFL's Washington Redskins. But hockey was the Hamilton native's first love. And when he was awarded an NHL team for Los Angeles, he began planning a gleaming new sports palace in LA.
I think at that time, Los Angeles was an outpost for hockey. We had the original 6, and then the Kings came in, the first expansion in '67, and Hockey is a foreign sport in Los Angeles, and Mr. Cook believed that you had to have this. The same with the basketball. I think he believed in the star system, and although the Kings had a very solid team under Bob Pulford in the early 70s, they went to Detroit and acquired Marcel Dion. He felt that he had to have a star in Los Angeles. Kareem Abdul-Jabbar came over for the basketball team, and Mr. Cook loved to have nicknames. You know, we had to have some catchy phrases. So I think some of the original players like Eddie Joyal became Eddie the Jet Joyal, and he liked to have different monikers for the players so that the fans could identify with them. They brought in Eddie the Entertainer Shack came in to play for the Kings. So there were most of the players in the early years had some great nicknames.
Eddie Joyal wasn't the only established NHLer who would be uprooted by expansion. The new teams were stocked with players from the original 6 in the league's first expansion draft, held in June 1967. Legendary Hall of Fame goalie Terry Sawchuk went to Los Angeles.
It's all over. The Toronto Maple Leafs have won the Stanley Cup.
Maple Leaf stalwarts Bob Vaughn and Kent Douglas went to Oakland after the Leafs won the Stanley Cup. Chicago lost defenseman Moose Vasco to Minnesota, and Charlie Hodge went from Montreal to Oakland. It was also decided the 6 new teams would play in their own division. 4 months later, the NHL opened its 50th season with 12 teams. But this new league would play to mixed reviews.
So we have the franchise, we have our expansion team. We're getting ready to start. We're going to play our first game in the Spectrum in a few days, and the city decides to give us a parade from the center of town all the way down Broad Street to the Spectrum. So they put us in convertible cars, and we lined up to go down Broad Street to the Spectrum, and we were going down Broad Street, and here we are in this great parade, and nobody's there. Nobody's there. I mean, I'm telling you, people were standing on the street saying, what is that?
That first year in St. Louis, and St. Louis was the late addition to the 6 expansion teams. And they got off to a terrible start. And Scotty Bowman took over as coach after about 15 games. But we only made the playoffs the last weekend of the season. And by then, interest in St. Louis, which was mild to moderate, became overwhelming, and we were filling the buildings, and the people got captured up in it. And we beat Philadelphia in a 7-game series, and then beat Minnesota in a 7-game series. And so then we were in the finals for the Montreal Canadiens. So it really did ignite hockey interest in St. Louis back then.
Attendance wasn't the only challenge during the first year of expansion.
All of a sudden, at one of our events, not a hockey event, the roof, quote, blows off, end of quote. Well, actually, it was tarpaulin, covered the roof, and it left a big hole, and we could have fixed it in 24 hours. But it became a political football. They closed the arena, and we had to play our last 8 regular season games on the road. Also, we had to refund the money, which I didn't have. But the bank was so impressed with what we had done up until that time, they came in and said, how much do you need? And then, of course, we recovered the money from a very reluctant insurance company because we had business interruption insurance, which saved us, quite frankly. But, I mean, we had to play on the road to know people. We went to a couple of places, and we finally ended up where our minor league franchise was at the time in Quebec City. And that's where we ended up. We still won our, division.
The The Minnesota North Stars, unfortunately, suffered the greatest loss of all during their inaugural season. The North Stars had acquired U.S. national team member Bill Masterton. Masterton scored the first ever goal for the franchise. But on January 13th, 1968, 4 minutes into a game against the Oakland Seals, he was checked by 2 Oakland players and fell back onto the ice, hitting his head. Masterton suffered a massive brain hemorrhage. He died 2 days later, never regaining consciousness. His death resulted in intensified lobbying for more hockey players to wear helmets. The Bill Masterton Trophy, named in his honor, is awarded for dedication, sportsmanship, and perseverance. As part of the new configuration, it was determined that the playoffs would take place within the 2 divisions, meaning the ultimate Western Division champion would advance to the Stanley Cup final. This was great news for St. Louis, who had picked up Hall of Fame goaltender Glenn Hall in the expansion draft. They also augmented their roster with former Montreal Canadiens greats Doug Harvey and Dickie Moore. Under new coach Scott Bowman, they would make the finals in the first year of expansion. They would repeat the next 2 seasons.
We ended up with good teams, and most of the expansion teams, the attendance was good. So, like, yeah, the people must have accepted it, but it was tough to build into good teams. Like I say, it had to be old guys or young guys, and in the original 6, basically didn't lose anything, and it was 2 leagues, the original 6 and then expansion, and we would cross and play, but in the playoffs you would play in your own division. Expansion played and the original 6 played, and then they met.
Joining Hall between the pipes was fellow Hall of Fame goaltender Jacques Plante.
We had the best goaltending tandem in the NHL, but the way the system was devised for the expansion teams coming in initially was that there were very few quality young players made available to us. So your only option was to go on veterans, and the likes of Lynn Patrick and Scotty Bowman, we picked up some solid NHL veterans, and we were able to make a great trade with the New York Rangers to acquire Red Berenson, who became an instant star from being a part-time player with the Rangers. But we had a lot of veterans in the twilight of the career. Doug Harvey played, Dickie Moore, Phil Goyette, just on and on. So it definitely helped our club out once we got into the playoffs, because we had a lot of players who had a lot of rings and who knew how to win those type of games.
Expansion was totally unfair. The existing teams, the original 6, gave up nothing. They gave up some old guys that they figured couldn't play anymore, and some young kids that they felt would never play. I think, and St. Louis represented expansion for the first few years, and I think we really represented expansion very, very well. And had it not been represented that well, I think it would have been more difficult for people to accept it.
Unfortunately, the new franchise in the Bay Area was beset with problems. The proposed new rink for Oakland was never built, and after 2 unstable years under owner Barry Van Gerbig, the Seals were sold to the notorious Charlie O. Finley in 1970.
It was tough because the first year of expansion in '67, Oakland had been picked to be the best of the new expansion teams, and unfortunately they were a total flop on the ice, and they were a total flop at the box office. The people that took over the ownership of the Seals had asked me to go there during that year, and I was in Pittsburgh and had a commitment there, and I said I couldn't until the end of the year. And so when we went out there, we made a number of changes. We brought in Freddie Glover as our coach, and we made a number of player changes. And we were fortunate enough our first year to go from last place to second place and go to the semifinals of the Stanley Cup. So it kind of created some interest in hockey. And the next year we made the playoffs again. We're eliminated in the quarterfinals. And then the following year, Charlie came. And I'm not sure that Charlie Finley's real interest in coming there was because he really wanted to own a hockey team. He also owned the baseball team, and he was having trouble with his lease. So Charlie looked at hockey as something that to play with, and not really, he didn't really know that much about it. He and I had a lot of battles about how a team should be run, and like I said, eventually we agreed to disagree, and I moved on.
The veteran players on the teams had their own adjustments to contend with.
I played a long time. I was pretty near 40 when I retired, which is not really considered. It was considered gold at that time, but it was expansion, and they were looking for an old goalkeeper. They said, well, with age comes wisdom, one of the great fallacies that's ever been told. But we were doing something we liked, so I enjoyed most of playing hockey, except playing hockey. It was the great friendship we had with our teammates, and like I say, that when you stop the puck, goalkeeping is a lovely position. It's not a great position when you're letting it in.
Pittsburgh was also looking to veteran leadership. Andy Bathgate was brought in to lead a franchise mostly made up of minor leaguers. The team struggled in the first 2 years and went through many changes. Red Kelly was brought in to coach, but still, talent was thin. Unfortunately, tragedy struck in 1970 when promising rookie Michel Briere died after being injured in a car crash. His jersey number 21 was the first to be retired by the franchise. Despite the lack of success and a bankruptcy claim in 1975, the Penguin franchise survived. Their real success would come in the late 80s and early 90s, following the rise of Mario Lemieux. In Philadelphia, the Flyers had overcome some of their early off-ice challenges. Eventually, they'd pick up some players who would turn out to be useful. The team began to improve. It helped, of course, that the Flyers drafted a center from Flin Flon named Bobby Clark in the second round of the '74 draft. It also helped that the Flyers brought in Freddie Shero to coach the team, and his unusual approach to the game proved to be successful.
What we did is we hired our general manager and our coach a year prior. The day we got the franchise, we hired them. And they scouted the 6 original teams because there was going to be obviously an expansion draft. And there were going to be a lot of players available. And I think we did an incredible job in the expansion draft. 7 of our players played on our Stanley Cup team that we got in. You know, usually when you get an expansion draft, by the time you're a strong club, the guys that you got in expansion are mostly gone. But the guys that we got played a major role in our winning the cup. We got Bernie Perrant. He was the goaltender. Incidentally, we traded him to Toronto and got him back before we won the cup. But we had Doug Favell as our backup goalie. We had Gary Dornhofer. We had Joe Watson. We had Ed Van Imp. I mean, you know, it was really a tremendous expansion. So that gave us the foundation, and those guys were with us all the way through. And when we brought in kids, you know, they all adhered to our program. And of course, you have to get lucky too. We got Bob Clark in the second round of the first universal draft. I mean, a little known point is that the first 2 years of expansion, there was no universal draft. We couldn't really get the good players. The original 6 guys kept them all for themselves. And they relented in the 3rd year to have a universal draft. And that's when we got Bob Clark, and he became our leader and one of the great players of all time, and led us to the Stanley Cup along with Bernie Parent and the rest of the guys.
You've got to draft good young players, obviously, like you still have to do today. Keith Allen and Mr. Snyder, the year before I got here in the playoffs, St. Louis had really, or maybe it was 2 years before, had really physically beaten the heck out of the Flyers. They're a small team, so Flyers went out and drafted Schultz and Selesky and traded for DuPont and drafted Bob Kelly, and all of a sudden we were tough. We were tough enough to physically play with these other teams. They couldn't rough, in those days you could intimidate other teams. So once we were tough enough to play, then our skill players could play, and we traded and drafted Barber, traded and got McClish, and all of a sudden we're a pretty good team.
Well, I mean, we won in 7 years. It had never been done before. And, I'm quite proud of that. It was pretty spectacular. And this city is a hockey city. And it became a hockey city in the years leading up to the Cup. I mean, it wasn't the Cup, but the Cup was the icing on the cake. And we've been very successful ever since. And when you look at the success of this franchise, it's also interesting to note that when the Hockey News graded the expansion in 1967, of the 6 teams, we were voted least likely to succeed. And the reason we were voted least likely to succeed is because hockey had never succeeded at any level in Philadelphia. And one of the little-known facts is that in the mid-30s, there was a National Hockey League team in this city for 1 year. Had the worst record on the ice, the worst attendance, and went out of business after 1 year. Every minor league team that tried to make it a success in the city failed. So it was natural that they said, we would be the least likely to succeed. And naturally, I was scared to death, because I thought we were going to succeed. And, I had put everything I owned and begged, barred, and did whatever I could to put this franchise together. And I said, holy cow, what's going to happen if it doesn't succeed? And so the excitement of knowing that we have a very, very successful franchise, we've been successful, we won the Cup in our 7th year of existence. I think we've been the most successful of those 6 expansion teams, several of which no longer exist, is very satisfying.
In the years following the 1967 expansion, the NHL would bow to public pressure and award a 3rd Canadian franchise to Vancouver. The Canucks came in along with Buffalo for the 1970-71 season. The game would enjoy success in its 2 new cities. The same couldn't be said for Long Island and Atlanta. They were added 2 years later, partly to block the threat of the upstart new World Hockey Association.
Looking at the situation there, it was really different than any other expansion or any other new team coming in, simply because we were not going to be the only team in the market. The New York Rangers were a pretty well-established team. They were probably, if not the best team in the league at that time, certainly the 2nd best. Very strong team with established stars, obviously, and with Rod Gilbert and Jean Rattel and Eddie Jackman and Brad Park. They were serious Stanley Cup contenders, and one could see that they were going to be for the next few years. So, the chances of us really competing for the first few years were pretty slim. Second of all, obviously, the Rangers are the most dominant team PR-wise, as well established. And the structure of the league was a lot different then. There were only 14 teams. We were put in the East Division, whereas the Atlanta Flames went in the West. In the East Division, and obviously the Montreal Canadiens, the Boston Bruins, it was a much stronger, tougher division. So it's pretty clear to me that where we were going to end up for the first couple of years. And in coinciding with that, the draft then was a 20-year-old draft. You knew that in the next few years, coming out of junior hockey in Canada, and there was some really outstanding talent coming. And so I simply sat down with the ownership and I said, look, we can go piecemeal and try and you know, bring in an old guy here, an old guy there, and create some. Or I said, we can just go for the entry draft and spend our time, effort, and money in looking down the road 3 to 5 years. And when the Rangers will be a much older team and we'll be a much younger team, and our talent, if we do a good job in our drafting, obviously then we felt we would draw in the New York market, that there were enough obviously in that market that we would be a decent draw even though we weren't winning. And so that's basically the approach I took for those reasons. It was a little tough. We only won 12 games the first year. And every city we went into, I remember the headlines, here come the hapless Islanders, and it was a little tough to take. The expansion draft was not a very generous one. I think there were only 3 established NHL players we got out of the expansion draft, Eddie Westphal being the most obvious. But the second year, we made a couple of moves and the team improved. I brought in Al Arbour as the coach, and we knocked 100 goals against off our record, which was a big thing. And defensively, we started to get better. And then obviously, we did a good job in the entry draft. And second year, we drafted Denny Potvin, which is obviously the first big step. And that's the way we went. It was a tough couple of years to get it off the ground, but once it started to take shape, it was pretty exciting.
Tonelli to Nystrom. He scores! Bob Nystrom scores the goal. The Islanders win the Stanley Cup.
It was very exciting.
Well, Bob Nystrom had the habit of getting overtime goals less than a man.
Just 8 years after that dismal first campaign, the Islanders would go on to win their first of 4 straight Stanley Cups. The league continued to change through the 70s and 80s. Kansas City and Washington were added in 1974. 5 years later,
And as I say, I'm very pleased to report that the board supported that recommendation, and we can proceed to an expansion of the National Hockey League for the 79-80 season of adding 4 new teams. There are a number of conditions that have to be met, but the committee and I think the board is quite confident that our friends in these cities will be able to meet these conditions, and that come next season, we will be a league of 21 teams.
The NHL absorbed Winnipeg, Edmonton, Hartford, and Quebec from the WHA.
Cement ball, Gretzky is up there. Gretzky! Score!
There were also a number of franchise relocations. The Flames would never take in Atlanta and were moved to Calgary in 1980. The Kansas City Scouts would move to Colorado and then New Jersey, where they would find a home.
Russell a shot, picked out by Lindbergh, rebound, run, score!
The NHL existed as a 21-team league for 11 years.
Reset, he's in, scores! And look at that look on his face, that first NHL goal.
In 1991, the league would welcome the San Jose Sharks. Then, Ottawa and Tampa Bay would join a year later.
Peter Klima got to a loose puck in the Oilers zone, and it's a 3-0 hockey game.
In 93, they continued their move into the Sun Belt by adding a team in Anaheim. The Mighty Ducks raised the bar in entertainment and increased hockey awareness in Southern California.
Joe Sacco tries to drive towards the net, shoots and scores! Joe Sacco goes right to the net.
The New York Islanders weren't the only team that Bill Torrey helped succeed as a new franchise. In 1993, he was named president and general manager of the newly formed Florida Panthers.
We had a unique bunch of players. I just saw Mike Huff here the other night at the dinner for Roger Nielsen, and we were talking about what a unique group of players they were. They all pulled 100%. They worked extremely hard. They were very, very good. That was a very good defensive team. We did not have a lot of goal scorers, and obviously it's tailor-made for Roger Nielsen because that's the kind of game he liked to play. And with Mark Fitzpatrick and John Van Beesbrook in goal, we had outstanding goaltending. We were a hard team to play against. I mean, from an energy, work ethic, never had a team that worked harder. And the pride they had, and they just would never give up. And we started in the playoffs. I think beating Boston gave a big emotional lift to this team. The Bruins obviously were heavily favored, and we beat them. And it wasn't like it was a fluke. We beat them, you know, in a good, solid effort. And I gave our team a big lift so that when we moved on to Pittsburgh and we played Mario and Jaromir Jagr, obviously we were huge underdogs, but we shut them down, literally. And Roger did we just, you know, the whole emotion that our team got on a roll there, it was a great ride. It was a tremendous thing for hockey in Florida. The new arena that we now have and live and play in Sunrise, which is one of the best new buildings built. It's an outstanding facility. We never would have gotten the financing for that done had it not been for that run. So it was a huge thing for the franchise.
The NHL awarded 2 more franchises, the Atlanta Thrashers and the Nashville Predators, to close out the decade.
I've never been to Nashville before in my life, and I had heard all of the stereotype descriptions that everybody else had, that it was, all it was country music, and of course I knew it was a non-hockey market, so there's a couple of strikes that are against your starting, but Craig Leopold, the owner, had a vision, had a beautiful a new arena, and he certainly sold me on the potential of the city, and everything you do in life is a little bit of a leap of faith, but I think that's great. And they really want you to succeed there. I mean, they're proud that NHL hockey is there in Nashville, and they want their city to grow and to be recognized nationally and internationally. And I think the NHL is a little bit of a vehicle to do that. So we've had nothing but positive experiences of being in Nashville.
Walks in on Vaucoon, rebound, oh my, Vaucoon again, and another save as he makes 3 outstanding saves in succession.
Despite the previous failure of the Atlanta Flames, the NHL awarded a new franchise to the city in 1999 called the Thrashers.
Cutting out of the corner to Holik. Oh, what a save! Davey Rose without a stick, and he slides across.
In 2000, the league then grew to its current 30-team format, adding a new franchise in the Twin Cities called the Minnesota Wild and another in Columbus, the Blue Jackets.
Shot, Roberts, rebound, Tugna. That's not fair.
While the jury is still out for some in regard to expansion, it has certainly created new hockey fans in unforeseen places. Who would have thought back in the days of the original 6 that cities like Tampa Bay, Anaheim, and Dallas would be home to NHL teams? And not just any teams, but Stanley Cup winning teams.
I'm in favor of expansion to cities that make sense and to communities that make sense. The hockey people, which I'm a hockey person, but when I say the general manager types, oftentimes are against expansion. But I think from a business and league point of view, it's a good thing because it expands the sport.
The Blues were an extremely hard-working, solid, defensive type hockey team who struggled at times to score goals like all the expansion teams did. But from there you had to build your team up so that you could compete evenly with the existing teams. And it took about 5 years, but finally the expansion teams started to catch up to the existing teams at that time. And then you looked at the Philadelphia Flyers when they won back-to-back Stanley Cups in the early 70s.
So the naysayers, say that hockey has, a very small base of loyal fans, that's a bunch of bull. We have millions of fans in the city, and we know what we have. And so it's not a great thing for the city, but more important, it's not a great thing for us because we've got great fans.
June 5th, 1967. A day that changed the game.